London shuddered under the wailing shriek of air raid sirens. Lieutenant Lewis Keller ducked into the underground station, joining dozens of other Londoners seeking shelter from the imminent Luftwaffe attack. He adjusted his Royal Air Force uniform, noting the tired faces that barely registered his presence. After 3 years of war, uniforms no longer drew attention in these communal refuges from death falling from above. "A good night to die, wouldn't you say, Lieutenant?" An elderly man offered him a cigarette, which Lewis declined with a polite gesture. "I prefer to focus on survival, sir." Lewis checked his watch, calculating the hours until his next mission briefing. If the all-clear sounded by dawn, he could still make it to the airfield on time. The distant thumps of bombs punctuated his thoughts. Each explosion was followed by a collective holding of breath in the station. Lewis had long since trained himself not to flinch. Emotion was a luxury combat pilots couldn't afford. He'd watched too many friends shot down after allowing sentiment to cloud their judgment. The last, his wingman Robert, had diverted to check on his fiancée's neighborhood after a bombing, only to be caught by a Messerschmitt on his return. No, Lewis had learned his lesson. Keep your heart locked away until the war ends, if it ever does. Love was a distraction that got good men killed. "Excuse me, Lieutenant. Is this seat taken?" Lewis looked up into the most remarkable green eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a young woman in a nurse's uniform, her chestnut hair escaping from beneath her cap, face smudged with soot but possessing a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the chaos above. "Please." He shifted to make room on the bench. Katherine Allen. She extended her hand with a forthrightness that surprised him. "St. Thomas Hospital. Lewis Keller. 242 Squadron." He took her hand briefly, noting the roughness of her palms, working hands, not unlike his mother's. "Fighter pilot?" She nodded at his uniform. "You lot are keeping us rather busy these days. And you lot are keeping us alive to fight another day." A particularly close explosion rattled the station, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. Several children whimpered, and Lewis noticed Katherine instinctively reach toward the sound before catching herself. "Pediatric ward," she explained, following his gaze. "You develop certain reflexes." "I understand. In the air, you develop different ones." Katherine studied him with those remarkable eyes. "Yes, I imagine you do. Like not getting attached to people who might not be here tomorrow." The directness of her observation struck him like a physical blow. Lewis found himself unexpectedly disarmed. "Something like that," he admitted. "We've had 3 pilots die under my care this week. They all had photographs of sweethearts by their beds. I wondered if it helped them hold on longer or just made dying harder." "And what's your professional opinion, Nurse Allen?" "That living without love makes surviving rather pointless, Lieutenant Keller." Before Lewis could respond, the station lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lanterns cast eerie shadows as another explosion, closer this time, shook dust from the ceiling. In that moment of shared vulnerability, Lewis felt something crack in the careful fortress he'd built around his heart. The air raid lasted until dawn. Through those hours, Lewis and Katherine talked about her childhood in Devon, his studies at Oxford interrupted by war, the patient she couldn't save, the friends he'd lost to the unforgiving skies. When the all-clear finally sounded, Lewis realized with alarm that he had less than an hour to report for duty. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" he asked impulsively as they emerged into the grey morning light of a battered but unbowed London. "I'm on night shift at St. Thomas for the next fortnight," she replied, straightening her cap. "But perhaps, if there's another raid." "There will be," Lewis said grimly. "Hitler is nothing if not reliable." Katherine smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her tired face. "Then perhaps I'll see you underground, Lieutenant Keller." "I rather hope so, Nurse Allen." As Lewis hurried toward his waiting transport, he realized he'd broken his own cardinal rule: never make plans for tomorrow when flying combat today. Yet somehow, for the first time in months, he found himself fiercely determined to return from his mission. Not just for king and country, but for the chance to see those green eyes again. For the next 3 weeks, they met in that same underground station whenever their duties and the Luftwaffe's schedule aligned. They found a peculiar rhythm in the abnormality of war, sharing cups of weak tea from Catherine's thermos, exchanging stories of their lives before, dreams for after. Lewis found himself counting the hours until the air raid sirens would sound, an anticipation that should have shamed him. "You're becoming a distraction, Nurse Allen," he confessed one night as they sat shoulder to shoulder, listening to a community choir spontaneously singing a Jerusalem to lift spirits during a particularly heavy raid. "Is that so terrible, Lieutenant?" she asked, her hand finding his in the dim light. "Perhaps we all need something to fight for beyond abstractions like freedom and democracy." "They're not abstractions when you've seen France fall," Lewis countered, though he didn't withdraw his hand. "When you've watched Rotterdam burn." "No," Katherine agreed softly. "But they're not enough either. Not for the human heart." Above them, London burned, while below, something fragile and unexpected blossomed in defiance of Lewis's careful rules. Their worlds collided completely on a rainy October evening when Lewis's squadron mate was brought into Catherine's ward, badly burned after his Spitfire took a direct hit. Lewis arrived still in his flight gear, having landed less than an hour before. "Can you save him?" Lewis asked, watching Katherine change Jameson's bandages with gentle efficiency. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But I'll do everything I can." Lewis stayed long past visiting hours, breaking yet another of his rules. When Catherine's shift ended at midnight, they walked together through the blackout-darkened streets, guided by the dim beam of Lewis's torch. "I've been assigned to a different squadron," Lewis said suddenly. "Special operations. I leave for training in Scotland tomorrow." Catherine's step faltered momentarily. "For how long?" "I don't know. That's the truth of it. I'm not permitted to say more." They reached the corner where they would normally part ways, Katherine to her nurse's dormitory, Lewis to his temporary officer's quarters. Neither moved to leave. "Write to me," Katherine said finally. "Even if you can't say where you are or what you're doing. Even if the sensors black out every other word. Just let me know you're alive." "It would be better if I didn't," Lewis replied, even as his heart rebelled against his words. "Cleaner. You could meet someone else. Someone with better odds of seeing Christmas." Catherine's laugh held no humor. "Better odds? In London? With the V1s falling? Don't be absurd." She reached up, touching his face with a steady hand. "I'm not asking for promises, Lewis. Just letters, when you can." The wail of air raid sirens cut through the night, ending their conversation as efficiently as a period at the end of a sentence. Lewis looked up at the darkened sky, then back at Katherine. "My boarding house has a shelter," he said. "It's closer than the underground station." They ran through streets already emptying of people, reaching the converted townhouse just as the first distant thuds of anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The landlady, Mrs. Pembroke, ushered them toward the basement door with practiced urgency. "Another nurse friend, Lieutenant?" she asked with knowing disapproval. "This is Nurse Allen from St. Thomas," Lewis replied stiffly. "We were caught in the open when the sirens sounded." The basement shelter was crowded with other boarders, but they found space on a bench near the back. As the bombs began falling closer, the building shuddered around them. A child's cry was quickly hushed by his mother. An older man led them in prayer, his voice steady despite the chaos above. In that moment of shared danger and fragile humanity, Lewis looked at Catherine's profile in the dim light and felt certainty wash over him with unexpected clarity. "Marry me," he whispered, the words escaping before he could reconsider. Katherine turned to him, eyes wide. "What did you say?" "Marry me," Lewis repeated, louder this time. "Before I leave for Scotland. Tomorrow, if possible." "You've lost your mind," she replied, though her hand found his again. "That's not something to decide in an air raid shelter." "On the contrary," Lewis argued, "it seems the perfect place. We don't know if we'll have tomorrow. The war has taught me that much." "What happened to your rule about attachments?" Katherine challenged, though he could see something hopeful flickering in her eyes. "It appears I've been outflanked, Nurse Allen." Lewis managed a smile despite the gravity of the moment. "I find myself attached regardless of my best strategic planning." The bombs fell closer, the basement lights flickering ominously. Several people gasped as the building shook violently. "Yes," Katherine said suddenly, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I'll marry you, Lewis Keller. If we survive this raid, if you survive Scotland, if I survive London, yes." The old vicar from the corner, who had been pretending not to overhear, cleared his throat. "I couldn't help but overhear, young man. If you're serious, I could perform the ceremony right here. No better time than the present in these uncertain days." Lewis looked at Katherine questioningly. She laughed, a sound so incongruous with the destruction above that several people turned to stare. "Why not?" she said. "Though I always imagined a white dress and my father walking me down the aisle." "We can do that too, after the war," Lewis promised. "Consider this the operational necessity and the other the proper celebration." The shelter residents, eager for any distraction from the terror above, quickly arranged themselves to create a makeshift aisle. Mrs. Pembroke produced 2 candles when the lights flickered again, placing them in empty bottles. Someone found a Bible, dusty but intact, for the vicar. A young girl with braided hair offered Katherine a slightly wilted daisy she'd been carrying. As Lewis and Katherine stood before the vicar, bombs falling around their shelter and candles casting long shadows on the concrete walls, Lewis felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. This wasn't recklessness or desperation, it was defiance against a world intent on destruction. It was choosing life and love while death reigned from above. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, raising his voice to be heard above the raid, "we are gathered here in the sight of God, and under rather extraordinary circumstances, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Katherine's hand trembled slightly in Lewis's, but her eyes remained steady, reflecting the candlelight and something more profound, a courage that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with facing it squarely. "I, Lewis, take thee, Katherine." A particularly close explosion shook dust from the ceiling. The candles guttered but held their flame, small points of light in the darkness. "I, Katherine, take thee, Lewis." The ceremony concluded with a kiss as gentle as it was brief, witnessed by strangers united in their shared refuge from destruction. The impromptu congregation broke into applause, a moment of joy stolen from war's relentless grasp. "Mrs. Keller," Lewis whispered against Katherine's hair as they held each other while the bombs continued to fall. "Lieutenant Keller," she responded with a smile that outshone the candles. Morning found them emerging from the shelter into a changed street, buildings damaged, fires still being fought, yet London endured. They walked hand in hand through the debris-strewn streets toward the train station where Lewis would depart for Scotland. "I'll write," he promised as the boarding call came. "Every day that I can." "And I'll be here," Katherine replied, straightening his uniform collar with practiced hands. "Patching up your friends and waiting for your return." The train pulled away, Katherine's figure growing smaller on the platform until she disappeared from view. Lewis touched the hastily procured ring on his left hand, a simple band borrowed from the vicar's wife until a proper one could be found. Lewis's training in Scotland lasted 3 months before he was deployed on classified missions over occupied Europe. His letters came irregularly, heavily censored but containing enough of himself that Katherine could hold on to the threads of connection across the distance. Katherine's hospital was hit during a bombing raid in January 1944. For 3 weeks, Lewis heard nothing, torturing himself with possibilities until a letter finally arrived, written in a shaky hand from a recovery bed in Oxford where she'd been evacuated with other wounded staff. "I'm fine," she wrote. "A broken arm and some cuts from flying glass. I'll be back on duty by March. The doctors say I was lucky. I told them luck had nothing to do with it. I made a promise to a fighter pilot, and I intend to keep it." By spring 1944, the tenor of the war was shifting. Lewis was transferred back to England to prepare for what everyone knew would be the invasion of Europe, though the where and when remained closely guarded secrets. He managed a 48-hour pass in late May, arriving at Katherine's new posting in a coastal hospital without warning. She was checking inventory in the supply closet when he found her, turning with a clipboard in hand to find him standing in the doorway. "Lewis!" The clipboard clattered to the floor as she launched herself into his arms. They spent precious hours walking along the shore, talking of everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the looming reality of the invasion they both knew was coming. "I've been assigned to a forward medical unit," Katherine told him as they sat watching the waves. "We're on standby for immediate deployment once it begins." Lewis nodded, unsurprised. Katherine had the experience they would need in the difficult days ahead. "We could be crossing paths in France, then," he said carefully, revealing nothing of his own assignment. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'll look for you in the skies. And I'll know you're somewhere below, putting broken men back together." When he left the next morning, they both felt the weight of what was to come. Neither said goodbye. It felt too final, too much like tempting fate. June 6 arrived with its momentous invasion. Lewis flew multiple sorties over the beaches, providing air cover for the troops pouring onto French soil. Katherine's medical unit crossed the Channel 3 days later, establishing a field hospital just behind the expanding front lines. Through the summer of 1944, they existed in parallel, sometimes only miles apart but separated by the demands of war. Their letters found each other with increasing difficulty as both moved across France with the advancing Allied forces. In September, fate intervened. Lewis's plane took heavy fire over Belgium. He managed to land in a field, but not before shrapnel tore through his leg. Local resistance fighters found him, delivering him to the nearest Allied medical station, where Katherine stood washing blood from her hands after finishing surgery on another pilot. The shock of seeing him wheeled in, pale and unconscious, nearly brought her to her knees. But years of medical training held her steady as she called for assistance. "This one's mine," she told the head surgeon, who recognized something in her voice that brooked no argument. Lewis woke to the familiar antiseptic smell of a field hospital and the even more familiar touch of Katherine's hand on his brow. "Am I dreaming?" he murmured, vision still blurry. "If you are, we're sharing the same dream," Katherine replied, professional demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the worry beneath. "You've lost a fair amount of blood, Lieutenant Keller, but you'll keep the leg." His recovery took weeks, during which the war continued its relentless pace. Katherine arranged to remain at the same hospital, pulling rank and calling in favors to avoid being transferred as the front moved eastward. By December, Lewis could walk with a cane, though his flying days were finished. "They're sending me back to England," he told Katherine on Christmas Eve as they shared a rare moment alone in the hospital storage room. "Administrative duties for the remainder of the war." Katherine's face showed the conflict she felt, joy that he would be safer, sorrow that they would be separated again. "When do you leave?" 3 days. Lewis reached for her hand. "Come with me." "What?" "Request a transfer back to London. You've been at the front for 6 months. They can't refuse rotation." Katherine shook her head slowly. "They need every experienced nurse here, Lewis. You know that. The fighting in the Ardennes is creating casualties faster than we can handle them." Lewis knew she was right, though it didn't ease the ache of impending separation. "Then I'll wait for you. In London. For however long it takes." 3 days later, he boarded the transport plane that would take him back to England, carrying Katherine's wedding ring. She'd insisted he take it for safekeeping, afraid of losing it in the chaotic conditions of the field hospital. "I'll send for this when I get my orders home," she'd said, pressing it into his palm. "Keep it warm for me." The final months of the war stretched like years. Lewis worked at Air Command, analyzing intelligence reports while his leg healed. Katherine's letters came less frequently as the Allied forces pushed into Germany and her medical unit followed, treating both Allied wounded and liberated concentration camp survivors. Victory in Europe came in May 1945. Lewis stood in Trafalgar Square amidst the celebrating crowds, feeling both the jubilation around him and the hollow absence of the one person with whom he most wanted to share this moment. Katherine's last letter had come from a field hospital near Munich 3 weeks earlier. "The things we're seeing in these camps defy description," she'd written. "Sometimes I wonder if humanity will ever recover from what we've done to each other." Then I remember that night in the shelter, with candlelight and vows exchanged while bombs fell, and I believe again that love might be stronger than hate after all. 2 more weeks passed without word. Lewis made inquiries, pulled strings, but information was chaotic in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender. Then finally, a telegram arrived, returning to London. Southampton Dock. June 12. All my love, K. Lewis arrived hours early, watching each ship disgorge its passengers, wounded soldiers, nurses, civilian personnel returning from the continent. The June sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon when he spotted her, thinner than he remembered, uniform faded and worn, but standing tall on the deck of the hospital ship. Their eyes met across the crowded dock. Katherine's face broke into a smile that erased the weariness of war from her features. She navigated through the crowd with single-minded determination until she stood before him, close enough to touch but both momentarily frozen in disbelief that they had actually, against all odds, arrived at this moment. "You kept your promise," Lewis said, voice rough with emotion. Katherine nodded. "So did you?" He reached into his pocket, withdrawing her wedding ring. "I believe this belongs to you, Mrs. Keller." As he slipped it back onto her finger, Lewis felt the weight of the past 5 years, the fear, the loss, the rigid self-protection he'd once thought necessary, finally lift from his shoulders. "Welcome home," he whispered against her lips as they kissed, heedless of the busy dock around them. "I am home," Katherine replied simply. "You're my home." That evening, they walked through a London transformed by peace, streetlights glowing without blackout covers, windows open to the summer air, music drifting from wireless sets tuned to celebration rather than news of battle. "What now?" Katherine asked as they paused on Westminster Bridge, looking out over the Thames. "It seems impossible that we get to simply live. After everything." Lewis took her hand, feeling the wedding ring that had travelled from London to Scotland to France to Belgium to Germany and back again. "Now we begin," he said. "We find a flat." You finish your medical training as you always wanted. I return to university perhaps. We plant a garden. We have children who will never know the sound of air raid sirens. It sounds so ordinary, Katherine marveled. After what we've lived through, ordinary seems rather extraordinary to me. Above them, stars appeared in a peaceful sky no longer threaded with searchlights or filled with the drone of bombers. Below, the river flowed on as it had for centuries, indifferent to the human dramas played out along its banks. Do you remember what you said to me that first night in the underground? Lewis asked. About living without love making survival pointless. Katherine nodded. I remember. You were right. I thought shutting away my heart was necessary for survival. I never imagined that opening it would give me something worth surviving for. They stayed on the bridge until midnight, watching London embrace its first summer of peace, two people who had found each other in darkness now stepping together into light.